Hello and welcome to week 2 of Organization, Leadership, and Decision Making. Our agenda for today is going to be to cover the assignments and briefly discuss the reading associated with this week. This lecture will likely be a good bit shorter than the last one, primarily because there's a bit less material to cover, not to mention we had to talk about the course and various other things last time. So jumping straight into the assignments. There are several things that you need to do this week. Start by reading the article that's outlined in the reading materials. If for some reason you can't find it using the link that's on the site, you can always look for it with Google Scholar. Inside here is the link. I will attempt to upload that as well. If you have any questions or have any challenges getting it, do let me know. So in particular, this week we're talking about the impact of change and change management within an organization. The article is an interesting article to read about complexity and to some extent trying to mitigate or manage complexity inside of the information technology world. It is especially inside of the digital version of the information technology. So hopefully by the end of the week, you're able to talk a bit about how the digital space is impacting organizations. So how digitization in general, adopting of digital approaches and so on are impacting businesses on a very real and impactful way. So again, start off by reading that paper. Pretty good, a little bit complex. We'll talk a little bit more about how to do that as well. So you're to create a 3 to 5 page paper. That does not include the title page or the references, as always. You do want to use APA and follow APA guidelines. So that thing means that you need a cover page. There needs to be an introduction, and note an APA introduction does not have a heading that says introduction. We'll talk more about that later, but in short, you have your title page. The first page of content will have the title as the first line, followed by a paragraph or two. Basically, that first section is understood to be the introduction. So you don't need to say this is the introduction because we expect that to be. That's what the point of that first bit of the paper is. Also, make sure that you have a body with a fully developed set of content. So in your introduction, you should include what's called a thesis statement. The thesis statement tells the reader what the point of the paper is. It's a fairly concise, fairly precise thing that you're trying to accomplish with the paper. You want to start with that thesis statement near the end. So you may introduce the topic of the domain of changes in the business world and all of that. And then you're going to talk about what it is you're actually going to accomplish with this paper. After you have that thesis statement, you have a list of subtopics that you're going to use to essentially address that thesis statement. And so that all belongs inside of the introduction. You'll also use that again and a slight variation of it in your conclusion, where after you've told the reader everything that you said you were going to tell them, in the conclusion you essentially restate the thesis statement, oftentimes in past tense, to show that you have done what you said you were going to do, and even you may even reference those subtopics to show this is how I did it. You don't use first person. I'm doing that so that you can understand what I'm saying. But that is the purpose of the conclusion. A lot of students turn in papers where they literally just write what is the core piece of the paper, and it's almost like somebody hanging up the phone in the middle of a conversation. They just stop writing at the point that they've done it. The purpose of the conclusion is to wrap things up, to organize the thought, to remind the reader what it was you were trying to tell them or going to tell them, and then to tell them the important stuff that they should take away from the paper. So again, you'll start by reading the article, and then you're going to talk a bit about how complexity is increasing, and how it's impacting organizations and what are those technologies inside of that the paper refers to, and how they're impacting organizations in a very practical and everyday sort of way. So as you're beginning to work on your paper, it's a good idea to review the rubric that is going to be used to grade the paper. This is a relatively standard rubric that I found and slightly modified elsewhere. But this shows you what I'll be looking for whenever I'm grading your paper. Note that if you don't do an introduction and a conclusion, you've lost 10% of your grade right there. So make sure that you include those two components. Also notice that 20% of the grade is associated with APA style and format. So make sure you're using an APA template and using so in an effective way. A key thing that students seemingly have challenges with, especially those coming from different universities, is where the citation goes inside of a paper. Inside of some ways of writing, it goes on the very last sentence of inside of a paragraph. And you're basically saying all this came from this source. APA takes a very different way where you cite a source on the first use of that source. So the very first sentence that is making a claim that is being supported by a citation should include a citation that links to the reference that supports it. So don't put your citations in the very last sentence. And in fact, um, generally speaking, there should never be a citation on the last sentence of a paragraph, because the last sentence of a paragraph should be kind of wrapping up the point of that paragraph and preparing the reader for the next section or the next paragraph. Also, whenever you're citing, inside of the first paragraph, whenever you use it, so maybe it's the first or second sentence in the paragraph, you add a citation. You don't need to cite that same source again unless you switch to a different source or at the point that you move to a second or a subsequent paragraph. So a typical paragraph might very well have one citation partway through, typically first or second sentence, and then it may not have any additional citations until you start another paragraph. That's assuming that you're using one source for all of the material in a given paragraph. Also notice that there's inside of the introduction, it's asking for a specific thesis statement if you want to get the excellent 100% of the score. And so that means that you need to be fairly clear on what it is that the paper is about. Also make sure that you're including a thesis statement, because if you don't include a thesis statement, it makes it very challenging for me to determine if you're actually kind of doing what it says that you're going to do. So focus and sequencing becomes very challenging if you don't know what the subtopics that are supporting a thesis statement are. So make sure that you get your thesis statement and your subtopics clearly identified in your introduction. And you want to, if nothing else, you may not write the entire introduction, although you could. You want to make sure that you know what your thesis statement is. What's the point of this paper in one sentence? And then what are the things that you're going to cover, which will likely be driven by the assignment. Also, inside of the paper itself, it's a good idea to use headings as far as organizing it. And those headings should correspond roughly to the subtopics that are identified in that introductory paragraph. Also, make sure you're using them as headings. You might want to spend a little time, if you're unfamiliar with APA, reviewing and researching how headings are supposed to be articulated inside of an APA paper. They should be title cased. They should not be the question or the prompts that were inside of the assignment. Rather, they should be something that's relatively succinct that tells the reader what the point of that paragraph or that section is going to be. Also, make sure you do reasonable spelling and grammar. Run something like Grammarly on it since you have access to it. Do a reasonable effort on your APA to try to get close to that. You can minimize a lot of those challenges by using a template. And then make sure that you're doing the citations appropriately as well. And you can do that in a way by using something like Zotero to do your citation management and integration with Word. So those things in combination are what you want to do, and you want to be looking at that rightmost column of figuring out what do you need to do to get the highest grade you can get on your paper, because this is exactly what I'm going to use whenever I grade your paper. Looking forward to next week, week 3, this is the goal and the objectives that you'll be trying to accomplish during that week. I like to kind of foreshadow it so you can kind of get some sense of how these things kind of tie together. So next week is going to be about how performance changes, how organizational performance changes leadership behavior. So how well the organization is doing, what does that do to how leaders are going to lead? And also be able to understand how innovation in products or processes can help an organization uh, with their internal innovation efforts. So inside of most organizations, if you're not innovating, you're probably having a competitor who is, and that's not a good thing. So having a culture of innovation, having a culture of taking risks and advancing and growing is an important part of every organization. So your reading is there. Chapter 2 in the text is the primary thing to focus on. There's some additional subsequent or some supporting reading if you're so inclined. For the week 3 discussion board, you're asked to reflect on the key concepts there on the right side, which is around organizational performance, which is an aspect of a model that's been presented. Um, and basically talk a bit about innovation and so on. Do make sure that you have at least one scholarly peer-reviewed resource in your initial discussion thread. Make sure that you also respond to your classmates in a constructive way, adding to the conversation. The point of these kind of discussions is to simulate something that might happen inside of a typical classroom, where someone might prepare a very brief sort of discussion around a topic, and then people would ask questions about it, and so on. So make sure that you're responding to at least two um, uh, posts, two of your classmates, and make sure you're including two of the lists that's there below. So if you do make an argument, make sure you do so in a constructive and respectful and academic way. Make sure that it's backed by facts, not opinions, and so on. But those are the ways that you can get full credit for your discussion board post and your responses. Circling back to this week's reading activities, uh, again, here's the link that will help you get your paper. You can also use the one that I had earlier. This one implies that you've set up that account correctly and so on. Probably worth the effort to do so, but that's where you'll get your paper. Taking a look at the abstract, there's a couple of things I'd like to kind of draw your attention to. The part there that's both underlined and bold is an example of a thesis statement. And to read it to you, the purpose of this special issue is to foster the development of new IS theories on the cause, dynamics, and consequences of complexity in increasing digital socio-technical systems. And boy, that's a lot of words, right? Socio-technical systems has a very specific sort of meaning. It's about the interaction between people and technology, and it traces back to some work done around World War II, maybe even a little bit before, that dealt with how technology and people interact with each other and how they can be used effectively for performance reasons. It actually came back from some coal mines and that sort of concept. So it's an interesting, and it's a specific thing. It's a thing, and that's a key thing to understand. And also, if you're looking at that, the purpose of this, right? Okay, that gives the reader a very clear indication of what's coming. And what's coming is a justification for somebody to read what they've written. The first part of this is about trying to kind of set the context, um, and kind of explain what it is, what's the world we're going to be talking about. And in particular, we're talking about the digital world and complexity. It has to do obviously with complexity because that shows up a lot of times, and as it relates to information systems. So that's part of that. And then if you take a look at what's underlined after the bold bit, that is actually an example of the subtopics that are going to be covered. So in this essay, we discuss the key theories and methods of complexity science. Okay, that's one subtopic right there. And illustrate emerging new IS research categories and opportunities in complex socio-technological systems, another subtopic. We also provide an overview of 5 articles included in the special issue. So this is basically giving you a bit of a sense of what the abstract is about in a lot of detail. So jumping into the, the, the article in general, there's some key things to understand. Almost always Uh, you don't read an article, a research article, start to finish. That's not saying you don't read it all. You may or may not, but the order is kind of specific, and that's because they follow a certain structure. If I want to write for a journal, I don't just write in any order. There's a pattern that it follows, and it follows the pattern of an abstract and introduction, typically a literature review followed by a method that explains what it is that I did and how I did it, and then typically some sort of details about the study, and then potentially some analysis, and then the summary or the application, and then typically the summary or conclusions. Things follow that kind of pattern, and that's the particular journal has usually very rigid sort of structure there, but everything follows that basic pattern. Because of that, you don't have to necessarily read the entire article, especially when you're doing your own research, not just reading something that you need to write about. So in this case, you typically you start with the abstract and introduction because that's going to set the context. The abstract is going to be the distilled version. It's good. It should, if it's a well-written abstract, include both the purpose of the research and the elements that go into it and the findings even, but at a very high level. The introduction is going to kind of set the tone, explain the problem that's being addressed in greater detail, and so on. What comes next is typically a literature review. You only want to read that if you're not familiar with the space. In this case, you may want to read it because you may not be familiar with complexity science. If you are familiar with it, then you typically skip over it. So if you were doing something like reading to write something like a thesis, you would do so in a very filtering sort of approach. You would read a lot of stuff and you would be about eliminating things from consideration. The way you eliminate them is by applying a set of kind of criteria in your own mind at each one of these steps. You take a look at the abstract and introduction. Does this article seem like it's going to fit well with my research? If the answer is no, you discard the article, move to the next one. If it's yes, then you move on. Okay, well, let's take a look. Maybe I don't skim the literature review because you should know it after a little bit. If it seems like a reasonable literature review, you probably jump to the conclusions and see what they have to say then. Then you may go look at the findings and kind of work your way backward. And then if it looks really promising, you would probably take a look at the methodology of how they actually did their thing to see if it seems like it's sound research or not. The next portion of the paper, or one of the key pieces of this paper, is the themes that are identified. And so it's an important thing whenever you're reading these sort of things to kind of understand what that means. Themes, again, is a thing. It's a qualitative research construct that is a way of organizing things into related kind of categories or patterns. There's an entire process one goes through to do this. You typically start with a lot of things and you start kind of trying to put the things that are similar together. And you start looking for elements either in interviews or articles or whatever it is that you're doing this sort of thematic research on, and start identifying those pieces that are kind of have something to do with each other and pulling them all together. So in this case, you do that and you consolidate, and then you consolidate until you reach a certain number of things, either a certain number of buckets, or at the point that you start reaching the place where if I combine two things together, I start losing information, then it's time to stop. So the researchers here came up with 5 themes, and these are pretty interesting and compelling. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking through each one of them. The first theme around designing IS to unknown or rapidly changing requirements. Now, that's pretty interesting because, like in information or software development, we have this concept of agile development. This is very similar, and the motivations are probably the same. Whenever you're setting out to build something, you don't necessarily know what it is you need in entirety at the beginning. You may think you do, but if you're not careful, it takes longer to build it than it does that life of that thing that you're trying to build it to. So that's where traditional software design processes like waterfall are not a great thing, especially when you're talking about multi-year projects, because the landscape inside of corporate America can change dramatically in the course of a few months, let alone years. So this is a similar sort of attempt to address that kind of same problem. The world is moving fast these days. Things change rapidly. There are unknown competitors that can emerge almost literally overnight. So whenever you're designing information systems, um, you sometimes have to do so with almost no real known requirements. So you have to build it to where it's incredibly flexible and agile and can change quickly. Or you expect that those requirements are going to change. So that means that it's more important to get something up and running that is useful and can be used today than it is to have the perfect thing. And more importantly, the thing that's implemented needs to be able to be changed quickly and rapidly because the world is changing very quickly. The next theme, so the second theme there, is about using digital technologies to steer a complex socio-technical system through phase transitions. Again, lots of words, right? Again, and also that socio-technological or yeah, technological system. So complex is also there. So what this is talking about is that we've got these systems that are relatively complex where people are interacting with them and so on. And they typically have some form of phases or life cycles of existence. So I would interpret this to be that it's about using a digital technology. So using the technology that could actually, if you're not careful, contribute to complexity, but using that technology to manage the process of managing the changes and transitions of these complex systems where people and technology are interacting. And then the third theme is understanding how complex institutional structures shape the evolution of enterprise information systems. And again, these are relatively complex terms, right? So if you break down what is complex institutional structures, so there's lots of different things that can be. It could be organizational structures as far as who reports to who, if it's a matrix versus hierarchical organization, and so on. But understanding that it the enterprise information systems is having to be changed or evolve or to grow in response to the complexity of the institutional structures. So again, pretty interesting theme, and these things are all aligned about technology moving faster, companies having to adapt quickly, companies having to change themselves quickly. And evolution of enterprise information systems is an interesting term because enterprise information systems are typically considered something fairly static in nature. Think about whenever we talk about enterprise information systems, we're talking about things like customer relationship management systems, enterprise resource planning systems, and so on. These are typically things which are very difficult and expensive to change. So because of that, they don't necessarily change all that often. Um, so interesting that we're now viewing this as in response to this complexity, we have to be making it such that those systems are changing where historically you might actually change the organization to go in line with the enterprise information system. And then the taming of complexity with algorithms. And this is also another kind of advancement that we've seen in general is algorithms have gotten much more interesting and advanced, especially in the space of artificial intelligence recently. With the advent of deep learning and convolutional neural networks, it's gotten to where we can address problems that previously were almost impossible to address. Also, computers, hardware, and software advancements are such that we can potentially do things now that in the past we couldn't have done because things are much cheaper, much more powerful, and we have distributed computing that we can leverage as well. So it would make sense that we would want to use this advancement in algorithms and software development and solving these sort of problems in a way to manage the complexity and potentially having a computer making a decision that a human might not be able to make the right decision because there's too many factors and it's too complex. And moving to the last and the fifth theme there, it's about IT-enabled competitive advantage in complex competitive markets, I believe is the part that isn't there. So the idea is using IT-enabled technology, using advanced technology to be more competitive in the marketplace and to compete against other organizations. We've already seen that a lot where organizations that are using IT effectively and using it innovative and new ways are able to do far better than their traditional sort of counterparts. Retailers that didn't embrace the change are slowly going away and eventually will be left only with those organizations that continue to adapt and adjust to the changing environment. So it's a very kind of consistent theme. So with that, I'll move on to the conclusion. If you have any questions about what I've said, do feel free to reach out and let me know. As always, I'm here to answer your questions. Stay safe, and I will talk with you next week.